welcome to another episode of Lingucast. We have another guest today. This is Dr. Jeff Green here at BYU, and we're excited to talk about linguistics today.
Hey.
So, to start, we love to ask people, how do you define linguistics?
Linguistics is the scientific study of language. So basically figuring out how language works and why it works the way it does.
Nice. Thank you. And how did you get involved in linguistics? How did you start on that journey?
Yeah, it's a good question. So basically God told me to. So I was an undergrad at University of Utah, and I wanted to be a pediatrician. I was taking a bunch of pre-med classes, working in a cell biology lab, like taking pictures of uh, brown algae and their microtubules and stuff.
Cool.
Um, and people would ask me my major, and I would say, "Oh, it's medical laboratory science. I want to be a pediatrician." And in the back of my head, I would hear, "or linguistics," even though I had never taken a linguistics class at all.
Wow.
Um, it just kept happening over and over and over. Every time someone would ask my major, it'd be or linguistics. And then one morning, I woke up with all these reasons why I shouldn't be a doctor. Um,
Hmm.
and so I just trusted that thought that I kept having. Uh, Started taking linguistics classes and fell in love with it,
Very
like,
cool.
immediately. Felt
Wow,
good.
that's really cool.
Yeah.
What was your language learning experience like growing up or up to that point or
Yeah, so I had taken French for 5 years in junior high and high school. Then I went on a mission for the church to Ukraine and learned Russian there, a little bit of Ukrainian, mostly Russian. And then I came home and in pre-med stuff and preparing for the medical laboratory science major, I didn't really have room to do language.
Sure.
Um, But then once I switched to linguistics, it was a smaller major in terms of requirements, so I had some room again. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do French again, try and remember that. I'm going to minor in Russian. So I did a little bit of French, went on a study abroad, and then came home and I was like, okay, time for something new. And it was either going to be Chinese or Arabic. So I landed on Chinese because I wanted to learn tones. So,
Nice.
and then I've just dabbled in things since then.
Cool. I wonder, we haven't asked everyone this, but I wonder, like, if you felt as you were getting into linguistics and kind of falling in love with it, did you feel like the need or the desire or like pressure to learn a lot of languages, or did you not feel like that was something like important to being a linguist?
Um, I don't know that I felt like it was important to being a linguist, but I've always loved it. So it like whether it was important or not, I was gonna do it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I loved it. It's a hobby.
cool.
So the thing is that a lot of professors, they tend to be bilingual. They know at least one language or sort of dabble in other languages, or it can be like Chris who knows all languages. Tis and how do you like you? Because you definitely fit the stereotype of the linguist who speaks a different language.
Mm.
Right. I fit into that stereotype as well. So it doesn't really work with me. Who doesn't really work with me is because I don't help the stereotype, but we both don't help it. So how do you like explain it? As like, oh, you're linguist. How many languages you speak? You're like, oh yeah, I speak this much. And how do you
Right.
deal with that question?
So I basically say so first, that's not what it means to be a linguist. Being a linguist is just studying how language works. So you could actually do it knowing only one language. That being said, a lot of linguists do enjoy learning lots of languages, including me. And so then I list the five or ish that I know. Yeah. So
Cool.
I'm always first to point out that's not what linguistics is. It's studying how language works.
Yeah,
It just so happens that people who enjoy learning how language works enjoy learning languages too.
I guess that makes sense.
And how does your knowledge of linguistics help you? Helps you help.
Help you. Yeah. How does it help? Yeah.
In
I I'm thinking I think you're Russian here. So how does your
You can say in Russian. That's fine.
we'll translate later.
Yeah.
how does your knowledge of linguistics help you learn other languages?
I think that's a great question. I think that knowing linguistics, I know a little bit about how sound systems tend to work.
Mhm.
I know like the physical way that you make different sounds. And so, like, I'm trying to do Arabic on Duolingo, and Duolingo is terrible at teaching how to pronounce things. I'm
I know.
So I can like see a letter that it gives and like hear it and like I'm not really sure what's going on there, but then I can go look up that letter and see what the phonetic alphabet, the IPA version of that is. And then I can say, oh, okay, that's a pharyngalized like velar stop or something. And then I'm okay, I know how to do that. I don't think I've seen that one. But I can use that to say, okay, so that means I should do this with my mouth
Right.
and then keep trying to do that in ways to approximate what I'm hearing better. So
Right.
in terms of pronunciation, it helps. And then also in terms of just the grammar and seeing how words and sentences are formed and knowing some of the variation that exists in language and some of uh, the commonalities that exist, I can understand. And also just the ability to look at a specific language I'm looking at and understand relatively quickly, oh, this is what's going on, and that's why this sentence structure is different from English, and
Mm,
it's easier to remember because now I know why it's doing what it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've seen some of the same things in my language learning since I've become a little more knowledgeable about linguistics. It's really helpful.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, for sure.
And has become more. We were talking actually after last night's podcast, how my knowledge of linguistics actually made me more aware of my own accent. Because we were filming is like, I because there's a typical thing that Brazilians do when we over nasalize our vowels
mm,
in certain positions of like, oh, look at that, I nasalized there again.
Yeah,
I did. Things like that just happen. Like, huh, yeah. I become aware of it, even though I still make it, or even though I can control it more. Sometimes, too, depending on the situation, I am I'm basically aware of what's going on
yeah.
in terms of sound production.
yeah,
So definitely linguistics can help you with that.
for sure. Yep.
Cool. Um, so maybe to get into your specialties in linguistics, could you tell us a little bit about what your research interests are and what subfields you work in?
Yeah. So I started in grad school doing mostly syntax, which is sentence structure,
Mm-hmm.
and why certain sentences are possible but others are not in
Hmm.
language. Um, and that gets pretty heavy into theory.
Mm,
And I since then have kind of lost interest so much in the heavy theory stuff. And I've moved more into psycholinguistics, which is how we process language, how we actually, when you're reading or listening to language, how it is that you build those structures in real time, what predictions you make about the words that you're hearing and or reading, or about what's going to come up, what happens when your predictions are wrong, how
mm,
do you deal with that? How do you deal with situations when you have the context telling you one thing, the structure telling you another, and your like predictions telling you another thing? How do
mm.
you deal with that conflict?
Interesting.
And the area that I've looked at most with that is with reference resolution, figuring out who pronouns refer to or other referential expressions or
Mm,
like structural things that refer to people.
interesting.
Yeah.
Could you differentiate for us neurolinguistics and psycholinguistics?
Yep. Yep. So they, I guess, technically are separate things that overlap, but the type of neurolinguistics I do is really just a subset of psycholinguistics.
Okay.
So psycholinguistics is studying language in the mind. So how the mind handles language.
Hmm.
And you can do neurolinguistics by using brain-based tools to answer those questions.
Okay.
Okay. And other psycholinguistic measures work too that aren't based on the brain, which are then outside neurolinguistics. The other side of neurolinguistics is using language to learn about the brain, which is where
Mm,
it's sort of separate from
mm.
psycholinguistics.
Okay.
Um, but that's more like the neuroscience side. And I'm a psycholinguist that uses neurolinguistic measures in addition to
Interesting.
other ones.
Sure.
Yeah,
Are you a psycholinguist or a psycholinguist?
exactly. Exactly.
Have you done this job before?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I was in grad school, my one of the psycholinguistics teachers there, Colin Phillips, he is really into running. And do you know Ragnar?
Yeah.
You know, like this multi-person race. It's like 200 miles. Oh, yeah.
I was thinking of Vikings here real quick.
Yes, that too. This is a race. It's a 200-mile relay. And there's 16 people on your team, and you each take 3 turns, and you just go for
Crazy.
2 days straight, like through the night. So
Wow.
I did that with them. His team every year is the psycholinguists. Yeah,
Nice.
yeah, that's good.
Excellent.
And so, what are some studies in psycholinguistics you've done?
So uh, several. So I've done some looking at, like I said, different predictions that people make. Um, One thing that I've looked at is when you have um, context telling you, so using what's called implicit causality. So if I say, like, Harry got mad at Ron after he spilled the juice,
Mm.
who's the he?
Mm.
Yeah,
It-
that's the research I did.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you participated in that one.
I participated in that,
Oh.
and it was so freaking long. It got to a point where like it's like I'm done with this.
So, yes, to be fair, these psycholinguistic experiments, especially ones dealing with sentences, are often long and tedious.
Yes.
Mm.
And there are ways to get around that, but they end up leaving you with less control over your items, which
Yes.
makes it hard.
Mm.
So anyway, yeah, these are long experiments. So looking at like based on this context, who am I predicting you to talk about?
Mm.
And then what happens when the sentence then disconfirms that?
Mm.
So, in this one study, a neurolinguistic one that I did, we were looking at something like, um, let's see if I can remember the actual item. Nervous parent Jackson was impressed with midwife. I don't remember the name the RAs my students gave her. We'll say midwife Matilda or something. Um, when when you say he's impressed with her, you expect me to say something about him again. I mean, sorry, about something about her,
Uh-huh.
because you want to know what she did that was so impressive.
Mhm.
So, nervous parent Jackson was impressed with midwife Matilda when you're expecting me to say she,
Uh-huh.
and then maybe you'll expect something that midwives do, like when she delivered the baby successfully.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was looking at prediction of the pronoun, and then based on that pronoun and the context, prediction of the verb.
Mm.
And you can do measure brainwaves to see how well people are how much people are predicting these verbs, how the words, how hard they are to access in your head. But then I was looking at what happens when you get he instead.
Hmm.
Um, does that change your prediction? Do you no longer predict deliver? Because if you think he is the parent,
Right.
then it's not going to be the parent delivering the baby. Um, yeah, and that study was interesting because we found that people treated the he in different ways. So there were some people that had one brain response that sort of indicated maybe surprisal that we were talking about the person they weren't expecting.
Mm.
Mm.
Um, in which case, we found that they no longer were predicting deliver.
Mhm.
But there were other people that got he, and their brain response indicated either that they were that it so indicated they were doing some sort of reanalysis. So either they were thinking, "Oh, that's a typo. You meant she,"
Huh.
and they still predicted deliver,
Uh-huh.
or that same brain response was compatible with a response where they were like, "Oh, I thought the midwife was a she. Looks like the midwife's a he." So still doing reanalysis, but either way, still thinking I'm talking about the midwife, and they still predicted deliver.
Interesting.
So some people relied more on their predictions of who you're talking about and kept those.
Mhm.
Other people, when they got the unexpected pronoun, were willing to abandon those predictions, and they predicted different verbs.
Huh.
Can you actually like see how long people spend in each page? Because I remember looking at questions like that, and I had to reread a sentence like, well, am I reading this right? Because
Uh-huh.
I went back and forth. Like it took me a while to like, okay,
Yes.
more or less I'm going.
Yep.
I know more or less what's going on here.
Yep. You can. You can. So the midwife one, we presented them at a standard rate because the brain response we were looking at didn't really. It's sensitive enough that we don't have to get reaction times. Or you can combine them, but the one you were doing, um, is the type of experiment where you can measure reaction times, and you can actually measure it where you let them move one word at a time through the sentence and see where they're slowing down. Or you can do eye tracking and let them see the whole sentence and see where they slow down and also where they go back and like
Oh,
what they look at. So there are lots of different measures that look at difficulties in processing, that are really cool.
Cool.
and so this definitely helps with the reading processing. Is that correct?
It can. Yep.
And how do you? So a lot of people who learn languages want to improve their reading speed.
Mm.
What's the best way, in your opinion?
Oh, that's a good question that I don't know. So I know like what things people do when they read,
What do people do?
but I mean, they people skip words, and that's a totally normal and natural thing to do
Hmm.
because you can see parts of words beyond what you're fixating on.
Mhm.
Um, and more proficient readers tend to do bigger skips
Hmm.
because they can get more information from their peripheral vision, their parafoveal vision.
Interesting.
Um, but I don't know how to train people to do that. Um,
That's fair.
But like the readers, for example, so I've noticed as well that these proficient quick readers, are they more likely to misinterpret the information given the speed at which they're reading?
Potentially. So there's always this speed accuracy trade off, they
Yeah.
call it, where the faster you go, the less accurate you're going to be. Um, and so, yeah, that's definitely a concern. So if you want to completely understand what you're reading, go slowly.
Hmm.
But reading for speed, it's okay to skip some things and you'll get less out of it, but you'll be faster for sure.
So I wonder what, I guess I'm kind of thinking about when I've read about psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics, I've kind of read about it in acquisition context, like first or second language acquisition context. What are there other kind of, um, I guess I'm wondering, not necessarily, I guess like what the application of some of the things that some of the results that you're getting, like, can that be applied to other kinds of subdisciplines or things?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And a lot of you're right. A lot of psycholinguists look at acquisition of either a first or second language, and that research is a lot closer to applications because you can directly affect people who are learning languages, kids or adults.
Yeah.
But that being said, I think that the way science works in general, so taking a bigger philosophical view of it,
Mhm.
um, science always has a range of application. Okay, where you have some people doing research that is very theoretical,
Yeah.
that is doesn't really help people at all.
Yeah.
And then you have some people on the other end that are always directly working with how to help people.
Yeah.
And the knowledge travels back and forth always.
Mm.
Okay, so in terms of language processing, um, there are definitely downstream applications for like this prediction research that I was doing that it's not going to change the world. It's
Sure.
not going to help anyone be a better language learner specifically.
Sure.
Certainly not going to like cure cancer or anything.
Sure.
But if we understand more about how humans do language, then when things go wrong, people have a solid foundation of what happens when things go right,
Yeah.
and it makes them better able to understand what's going on wrong.
Yeah.
So, although most of my research is not super applied,
Mhm.
it increases that foundational knowledge upon which other people can build.
That's cool.
And that being said, I have at least collaborated with some people on second language acquisition stuff and have one one study that's been submitted, a couple others, oh, a couple
Mhm.
that have been submitted or published, and some others in the works that look at second language acquisition.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
yeah.
So you've done a little bit of second language acquisition as well.
Hmm.
What do you get? Of course, it's not area, but what would you know a little bit? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So especially from the neurolinguistic side, um, it's really and the psycholinguistic side. What some of my favorite studies are ones where participants' behavior is different from what the more implicit measures, like the neuro measures, are telling you.
Huh.
Oh,
So one of my favorite studies is by I think her name is Judy. Her last name's McLaughlin for sure. McLaughlin and Osterhout and Kim in 2004, I think it is, and they looked at early learners of French. Um, and they were looking at their brain responses to try and see how they were learning French words in the very first semester,
okay.
very early stages. And they were using a brain response called the N400, which is sensitive to how hard it is to access words in your head.
Hmm.
Okay, there are various theories of what that means, but it's sensitive to that at least.
Okay.
Um, and what so in this effect, if you present native speakers of a language with fake words,
Hmm.
they'll have a really big N400 because it's like their brain is trying to access it and they can't because it's not there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Then if you give them just a word without any supporting context, like let's say you hear the word chair and then you hear the word cat.
Hmm.
In this case, it was a reading study. So read the word chair and then read the word cat, but in French. Um, you'll have like a medium size and 400
Mm.
because you know the word, but there's nothing there to support it.
Mm.
Versus if you read the word dog, dog is going to be activated and then it's going to actually spread activation to other words
Mm.
Mm.
that are related to it. And so when you get cat, it's easier to access because you've already like pre-activated some of its features.
Ah,
So
okay.
then the N400 is smaller.
Okay.
So for native speakers, you get this three-way split between fake words, primed words, and non-primed words, and then primed words.
Okay.
And so they were looking at these non-native French speakers in their very first semester, and giving them these three types of words. And what they found is that after only an average of like 12 hours of classroom instruction, they already showed a difference between real words and fake words.
Mm.
Wow.
Um, even though no difference between the primed and the unprimed, so they didn't know the meanings yet, but they could recognize what were real words and what weren't. And
Wow.
then by the end of the semester, they showed that three-way split. And
Mm.
the coolest part of that study is that they were also asked just to identify, is this a word or not?
Mm.
And they were basically at chance. So they
Wow.
were guessing if these were real words, but their brains showed evidence that they knew it.
So it's crazy.
Yeah.
So could you get like a word that's I would say uh phonologically constructed to be a French word,
Hmm.
and is like, okay, this sounds like a French word, but it's not a French word.
Hmm.
So could they tell these words apart or no?
Yeah. So all the ones, these were all written,
Right.
and all of these non words were actually called pseudo words in
Pseudo
that they
words.
were possible French words. They just weren't real French words, like nazier, Nasier,
Mm.
nazier. That's not a French word,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but it looks like it could be one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So could
And their brain was distinguishing those.
What?
But
oh,
they were guessing when they tried to say if it was a real word.
but how could they guess it? What's going on in the brain?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it seems like the brain is so good at keeping track of things that it's seen.
Hmm.
And so even though after only like 12 hours of exposure, the brain was already like, I've seen that. I know that's
Mm.
real, because I've seen it before, versus I've never seen this, even though it looks like it could be one.
Wow.
And so, but then when they came time to telling whether it was a real word or not, that knowledge wasn't to a point that they could rely on it yet,
Fascinating.
consciously. And so we're actually running a replication of that right now,
Huh.
looking at French learners, but also at Chinese learners, because Chinese characters are really hard for English speakers,
Sure.
and for Chinese speakers. It takes a lot of effort for them to learn. Um, and what we're seeing basically is a similar pattern for both languages, but the Chinese does take a little bit longer.
Mm.
Mm.
Now, that could be because in French, you can easily like look at a word and sound it out and say, I don't think I've heard that. So you can rely on things you've heard and read in the classroom.
Oh,
Mm.
okay.
Whereas in Chinese, if you don't know the character, especially as a beginner,
Uh-huh.
it's hard to guess what the character is going to sound like. But
Sure.
once you get more proficient, you can get better at seeing a character and guessing what it will be.
Ah,
Um,
interesting.
but so you can't sound it out. So it could just be that because they're not as transparent
Mhm.
phonologically, that they're take a longer time to recognize them. Potentially, that's one possible explanation.
Mm.
I'm curious about like how does the multilingual brain difference from the monolingual brain in that in things.
Mm.
Hmm. That's another good question. So, um, it depends on what part of the brain you're looking at when you start learning the language, how proficient you are. There are a lot of variables that come into play, and it's still not 100% clear which variables are
Yeah.
important. But the general picture seems to be that so for most people, there are two major language centers that people talk about. Language is really done like all over the brain.
Hmm.
Oh, it's all over.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about meanings. So meanings of words and things, those activate areas all over the brain.
Hmm.
Um, but there are at least two major hubs of activity
Mhm.
that kind of connect to these other areas. And that's Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area might be a hub for like semantic processing, but it's also involved in other stuff. So when I say it's involved in semantic processing, that's like a really old and basic theory of it, and it's way more complicated than that. But we'll just stick with that for now.
Yeah.
And then Broca's is in like a hub for syntactic stuff, grammatical things.
Mm.
And again, it's way more complicated than
Sure.
that. Um, And what people have found is that if you learn two languages as a kid
Mhm.
and you become highly proficient in both of them, then those two languages activate the exact same area, or there's overlapping uh, activation for both languages in both of those two areas.
Sure.
But if you learn a second language as an adult,
Mhm.
what the original studies have found is that there's overlap still in the meaning section in Wernicke's area, but Broca's area, there's non-overlapping activation. So it's still in that same small part of the brain,
Hmm.
but they don't overlap.
Huh.
And so you treat them as more distinct, as if you, well, maybe not more distinct, because any kid who learns two languages can tell the two languages apart.
Sure.
But the resources that you use in your brain are shared if you learn them
Uh,
younger.
It,
Now, real quick. Sorry. Sorry. Um, I say when you learn them older, there's more recent research that says that it may not actually be age that matters, but proficiency. And kids learning both languages tend to be proficient in both, and adults tend to be less proficient in their second language. So it could be that when you become more proficient, then you start sharing resources more.
oh,
huh.
Yeah.
okay, okay.
Okay. That's all. Go ahead.
I was gonna ask about like in I normally say because we Sophie and I we've debated we debated a long time. What does it mean to be a native, to be fluent, and this whole thing?
Sure.
It's kind of like we talked to Dr. Stanley yesterday. Dialectology, people have no idea what it is. People are not aware, and it's the same thing as fluency
Mm.
that people are not aware. Like we talked to Dr. Cox about this,
Yeah.
how people define fluency and how native speaker is not a good indicator of fluency.
Right.
And what I'm when it comes to that kind of thing in the brain, like for me, for example, I know Portuguese isn't natively. For me to transfer, it's very easy. It is easy for me to transfer all the knowledge of Portuguese I have to Spanish
Mm.
or Galician. So like the would it if like learning Spanish for over a year, would it light up to as well?
Probably you would, I would guess, have a lot
Yeah.
of overlapping
Yes, of
activation.
course.
But we'd have to do an MRI
Of course.
to know for sure. But that would be my guess that there'd be a lot of overlap for you. One, because the languages are so similar, so you can transfer a lot of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But also because if you get proficient in Spanish, then it's likely to overlap. And there are other studies that look not just at where things are happening,
Mhm.
but in the types of processes your brain is
Oh,
doing
sure.
that also show that when you're not super proficient, you use different processing strategies than when you become more proficient.
Huh. What?
Oh, that's cool.
Um, so not super clear yet what they are, those strategies are, but one thing I talked about the N400,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
that it's sensitive to lexical access stuff. For early second language learners, you get a lot more people that have an N400 also to grammatical errors.
Uh-huh.
So they're like
Mm.
noticing the error, but they notice it and get an N400, which may be because they're treating it as just something I haven't seen before. It's
Mhm.
an unrecognized pattern.
Uh-huh.
And so you get an N400. For many native speakers, and I say many because there are some native speakers who also get an N400 to grammatical errors, but it's more common to get a P600, which is a different brain response that is maybe sensitive to like reanalysis type stuff.
Okay.
Um, and so for many native speakers, and we can talk more about what a native speaker means.
Okay.
Um, they have this P600 response, and a lot of recent-ish research in the past like 5-10 years has shown this progression where people start with an N400 in their second language and then move to a P600 as they become more proficient. And that doesn't have to take
Or
too long.
right.
It can be even just after a year or two of study
Hmm.
that people move to a P600.
Hmm.
But also showing the effects of proficiency on how you process stuff in your brain.
Wow.
And another question. How do you define a native speaker?
Good question. Um, Someone who learned the language starting as a kid
Okay.
and still knows it.
When is the like for example, Sophie met my sister, right? My sister, you cannot tell the difference between a native American English speaker and a Brazilian.
Mhm.
So she's completely bilingual. She came here when she was 4.
Mhm.
Then she moved back to Brazil.
Okay.
So she lost a lot of cultural contact she only had through the internet.
Sure.
A lot of her pragmatics
Uh,
aspects are very Portuguese, very Brazilian.
hmm.
So where would
Yep.
she fall into that category?
This is where it gets messy. And a lot of research has compared native to non-native speakers,
Uh-huh.
and there's a body of research now that is saying you shouldn't do that
Mm,
Oh, okay.
because it's saying, well, one, because it others the non-native speakers,
Mm-hmm.
mm,
and then also because the native speaker is not a homogeneous
right.
population.
Exactly. There.
There's a lot of variation, not in even in terms of not just in terms of proficiency, because like I said, some will have an N400, some will have a P600, but also because of these diverse experiences. Like if a kid is born in one country until they're 4 and moves to the United States, let's say your sister had stayed here, would she be a native speaker of Portuguese?
Maybe. Yeah, she still
But
know
but
Portuguese. Probably not
Right.
as
yeah,
proficient as if you had she not stayed in Brazil because
Yeah.
she
right.
the schooling also plays a big role in
Sure.
Mhm.
developing your lexicon.
Yep, yep, exactly. And even people born in the US and in many other countries will speak one language at home and then that is not the culturally dominant language.
Sure.
And so they're heritage speakers of that language. So by definition, they are native speakers because they learned it as kids and have spoken it their whole lives.
Mm,
But their behavior is going to be very different from a monolingual who grew up only in a
right.
country where that is the dominant language.
Right.
And so the notion of native speaker gets really sticky
Yeah.
and tricky. And there's cool neuro evidence also with that. And it may depend on what aspect of language you're looking at.
Mm,
So you said your sister, you can't tell that she's not, that
Um,
she
fr-
didn't grow up here.
from pronunciation.
Yeah, exactly. In pronunciation. But
mm,
there are other aspects like pragmatics.
Pragmatics, like I showed her in audios, like how can you tell, and she like a native English speaker would say, "Yo, like, hey," and she's like, "Oh, oh,
Uh-huh.
mm.
oh," like
Uh-huh.
that's something that
To get the
Brazilians do,
attention.
Uh-huh.
or like things like she'll say, hmm, like things like that that Americans don't do, but Brazilians do.
Uh-huh.
So that those pragmatic things is she has. But then again, or like Sarah here that came here earlier. She says the word like always like always makes me giggle when she says YouTube like in Spanish. The fricative, what's it called? The bilabial fricative.
Mm,
Mhm.
So she's still a native speaker, and yet she pronounces that wrong.
Uh-huh.
Like in how I'm not how I'm an American English speaker would.
Right.
mm.
Right. Yeah. So pronunciation is one that kind of sticks with you more.
Yeah.
Mm,
And there have been some cool brain studies that looked at adoptees from China. I
Uh-huh.
think it was in Canada, but anyway, in a non-Chinese speaking place.
uh-huh.
Um, and they did brain scans. So these are kids that were adopted when they were fairly young, and they checked age. And what they found is that um, so none of them remembered any Chinese. They couldn't speak Chinese at all. But they did brain scans while they were having them distinguish tones, Chinese tones.
Oh.
Um, and for uh, what they found is that, if I'm remembering right,
Mhm.
um, native Chinese speakers showed activation in both hemispheres, because the both hemispheres deal with auditory stuff, but especially in the language side
Mm,
of the left hemisphere, the native Chinese speakers show activation in both sides. Non Chinese speakers in the study only showed activation on the right,
mm.
because they were treating it as just an auditory task. Do these two things sound different?
Right.
Not a linguistic task.
Right.
But these adoptees who didn't know any Chinese but were exposed to Chinese as a kid showed activation in both hemispheres.
Wow.
So it's like their brains remembered that this was a linguistic thing,
Yeah.
even though they don't remember the language at all.
So cool.
So phonology, the pronunciation, really can't stick
Huh.
as a kid.
Yeah.
This reminds me of something that my dad used to do.
Mhm.
My dad tried to raise me bilingual, actually.
Mhm.
Like English, Portuguese?
Yes, English Portuguese, because he used to teach English,
Oh, yeah.
but when I was younger, and what happened, what he would do is he would just yeah, I have some recordings I can show you later. He would he would say these words means these words. You get like words like cat, it's a gato, and then later on he would record me he would record quizzing me in Portuguese like how would you say um gato in English. He was like cat, and then it's like janela, window. It's like window. And, like as a baby, he would do he would have to be translated from Portuguese to English. But thing is, I was raised completely Portuguese monolingual. So do you think that played a role in like developing because like affinity for like learning English into other languages? Do you think that played a role?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know of research that has looked at that directly, saying like if you're exposed to more language varieties as a kid, do you have more of an affinity for them later? I don't know. That's a good question. You should do research on that.
Very fun. Well, thank you so much for covering a wide spectrum of ideas and telling us about your research, and
Yeah, it was fun.
yeah, we really
That-
appreciate it.
Dr. Green, one final question is to end. If there's one thing about neurolinguistics that you would like people to know, what would it be?
It's friggin' awesome. No, but I guess more seriously, um, I don't know. I think my favorite thing is just that sometimes the brain does things that we can't do on the surface.
Mm,
So, especially because I think most people that are going to hear about this, their experience with language, or one of the things they experience with language is that either they want to learn a second language and it's really hard, or they think that they don't even know their first language.
Mm,
Like, oh, my English is so bad, I don't even know English, which is totally false.
yeah,
Um, so that don't even know your first language, that's not even a neurolinguistic question. That's just a linguistic question. You do.
yeah.
You know it perfectly. And then for the second language learners who struggle, I think some of this research that shows your brain can know stuff before you do
Mm,
kind of gives me hope as a second language learner
yeah.
that when I'm struggling, maybe I am learning stuff that I just can't tell yet. So just hang in there. Your brain is super amazing and flexible and powerful, and you can do it if you put in enough effort.
That's awesome.
yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. There were other things I'd like to cover, but this seems to
Yeah,
do the job.
yeah, this is
Thank
great.
you so much, Dr. Green.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.